I'm Meredith Langley, 39, project director at a mid-sized software firm in Seattle. The kind of role where you manage everyone's chaos, but quietly ignore your own. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 12th floor of a building overlooking Elliott Bay. On clear days, you can see the water burn gold before sundown. Most days, I keep the blinds half closed. Last Saturday, I sat on my living room floor wearing a dress I hadn't worn in years, watching my younger sister's wedding unfold on a screen. There were string lights taped to the window and a half-open bottle of Burgundy on the coffee table. The laptop was propped at eye level, sound fed through an old Bluetooth speaker. I had arranged the whole setup 2 hours in advance, like I was preparing for a presentation I wasn't part of. I hadn't been invited. Not formally, anyway. There had been a message, terse, obligatory, forwarding a link to the live stream with a brief note from our mother that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Still, I watched. I told myself it was guilt or curiosity. But the truth was closer to something colder, something I hadn't allowed myself to name. As the video buffered, my reflection flickered in the darkened screen. The dress was tighter than I remembered. I hadn't worn heels in months. Outside, the city murmured its usual Saturday night indifference. Traffic, laughter, the occasional siren in the distance. Inside, I waited for the ceremony to begin with a glass in my hand and a sharp, quiet anticipation in my chest. Something had already gone wrong. I just didn't know how wrong. Not yet. The stream flickered to life 23 minutes late. For a moment, all I saw was a static shot of a manicured lawn framed by blush-coloured peonies and a white arch wrapped in gauze thin chiffon. The angle wobbled slightly, then steadied. Guests drifted into view, men in tailored navy suits, women in sleeveless gowns better suited for California than Central Oregon in late spring. Some fanned themselves discreetly with the program. Others posed for photos in front of a rented floral wall bearing the initials C&M in brushed gold. I recognized most of them, neighbors from our childhood street, former co-workers of my father's, my mother's bridge club, still airbrushed into a permanent state of social elevation. The camera panned slowly across rows of chairs, past a champagne station, and finally settled on a wide shot of the ceremony site. The Grangers had chosen one of those destination venues that looked like an alpine spa. Clean white stone, neutral florals, and a view of the Cascades so expansive it seemed artificial. Camille wasn't visible yet. The bridal suite appeared briefly, and there she was, sitting at a white vanity, back rigid, veil draped loosely around her shoulders. A stylist hovered behind her, misting her hair. Her reflection, caught in a gilded mirror, was expressionless. The kind of look that would register as composed to anyone who didn't know her. But I remembered that face. It wasn't peace. It was endurance. Behind her, the bridesmaids busied themselves with meaningless adjustments, smoothing robes, checking lipstick, taking selfies they'd likely delete. One of them glanced at her phone and froze momentarily before slipping it back into her purse. Camille didn't notice. Or maybe she did and chose not to ask. Either way, nothing was said. The stream cut briefly, returned, then followed the groom's party. Miles stood near a patio door with his best man. Someone handed him a glass. Amber liquid. He downed it, laughed. The best man slapped his back, whispered something. Miles smirked. A woman in a pearl grey suit, whom I knew was his mother, walked into frame. She spoke to a man with a clipboard, the wedding planner, I assumed. Her gestures were small but pointed. The planner nodded, scribbled something and left. There was a strange rhythm to the feed, steady, then interrupted. It skipped the most predictable moments as if guided by an unseen editor with a taste for tension. It missed the music cues. The processional started mid-note. Bridesmaids walked too quickly, the groomsmen too slow. The pairing felt random, like assigned seats on a red-eye flight. Camille's best friend, Naomi, walked alone, bouquet held stiffly, eyes forward. She didn't glance at Miles. She didn't glance at Camille either. I noticed, but I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. And then Camille emerged, arm in arm with our father, framed by the archway of the bridal suite. Her dress was intricate, lace, structure, a train long enough to justify 2 flower girls. She walked deliberately, step by step, not smiling but not crying either. Her eyes moved constantly, as if scanning for an exit. My father held her gently but firmly, while his jaw clenched just slightly tighter than usual. My mother was already in tears. The camera followed them down the aisle. I texted my cousin Brandon. She looks like she's walking into a boardroom, not a wedding. He replied seconds later, "You have no idea what's been going on. I'll call you after." The ceremony itself was fine, generic. Vows had been rewritten to sound spontaneous. The officiant, some local judge, read from an iPad. When Camille and Miles faced each other, the camera caught the moment her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she reached for his hands. He smiled broadly. She didn't, not with her eyes. I watched as subtle things unraveled. Patricia, Miles' mother, leaned toward her husband and whispered during the readings. Naomi checked her phone again. My father tapped his knee with a program, out of rhythm with the music. Nothing exploded. Nothing caught fire. But the atmosphere felt charged, like metal under tension. At some point, I refreshed my drink and returned to find them declared husband and wife. I missed the kiss. They walked back up the aisle to polite applause. Miles pumped his fist. Camille blinked like someone just emerging from anesthesia. The screen lingered on frozen smiles. The recessional music faded too soon, replaced by ambient noise from the guests milling about. The next segment felt oddly voyeuristic. The camera followed the newlyweds and their families to a small footbridge for photos. The bridge was arched, ornate, and too narrow for the crowd that gathered. The photographer barked cheerful instructions while trying to arrange both families into a cohesive shape. It didn't work. The Grangers and the Langleys clustered separately, each claiming their side of the bridge. Camille and Miles stood at the centre, not quite touching. Naomi stood off to the side, no longer pretending to be engaged in the process. Her phone remained in her hand. At one point, the best man leaned toward her, whispered something. She flinched, said nothing. The microphone picked up voices it wasn't meant to. Patricia's in particular. She remarked that the orchids looked cheap and would wilt by dessert. My mother snapped back that Camille had chosen orchids and it was her day. Patricia replied that it was also their son's day and their name on the checks. The photographer smiled through it all, repositioning arms and shoulders like chess pieces. When the camera returned, the guests had migrated to the reception hall. The space was elaborate. Crystal chandeliers, an 8-tier cake, custom lighting. The DJ's voice echoed over a low hum of conversation. The seating chart revealed itself to be more than decorative. My family had been placed almost exclusively on the left side of the ballroom, the Grangers on the right. Mutual friends served as a human buffer zone down the centre. My father sat beside Miles's father, both men staring forward like airline passengers waiting for takeoff. Naomi was positioned 3 chairs down from Camille, unusually far for a maid of honour. I texted Brandon again. "What's with the Cold War seating chart?" He replied, "Patricia rewrote it last night. Camille found out this morning. It's a whole thing." The best man rose to toast. He was drunk, visibly so. His speech was a mixture of locker room humour and failed charm. He referenced Miles's wild side, then offered a limp reassurance that Camille had tamed him, sort of. Patricia's face was granite. Camille's smile turned glassy. Naomi's toast came next. It was careful, sterile. She barely looked at Miles. Every word was tailored to Camille alone. I watched her closely. She seemed uneasy, overcorrecting, measuring each sentence like a tightrope walker. Somewhere during the salad course, the camera captured Patricia again, this time leaning over to speak to Camille near the cake table. Her gestures sharp, Camille's posture even sharper. Whatever was said, it sent Naomi following her out of frame toward the hallway. I glanced back at the stream just in time to see Camille return. Her lipstick had been reapplied, her eyes had not. Miles greeted her with a distracted nod and returned to his conversation. The DJ announced that dinner would end shortly and the first dance would begin. Camille stood. Naomi hovered at the edge of the frame. A server appeared at the far end of the ballroom. She handed Naomi an envelope. Naomi opened it. Her face changed. She turned, walked quickly toward the wedding coordinator. Both looked across the room, at Patricia, then at Miles. The DJ tapped the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. and Mrs. Granger to the dance floor." I leaned forward. Something was shifting. Not loudly, not suddenly, but something was about to crack. The first dance began with all the expected elegance, soft lighting, a piano rendition of something familiar but carefully slowed to sound ceremonial. Miles held Camille by the waist, one hand cradling hers, the way couples are instructed to do in rehearsal. They turned slowly at the center of the parquet floor, a camera circling at a polite distance. Their expressions were composed, blank in a way that invited projection. To anyone watching without context, it was a beautiful moment. I watched without blinking. The guests formed a loose perimeter around the couple, champagne flutes in hand. The chatter had dimmed. For a moment, it felt like the wedding might stabilize itself, fall back into the choreography expected of events like this. It was a brief illusion, a controlled pause before momentum shifted. As the music tapered, the DJ's voice returned, slightly too loud. He announced a surprise. It wasn't Camille's surprise. It came from Patricia. The phrasing was careful, something about a gift, a celebration of Miles' journey. I didn't catch the exact words, only the way Camille stiffened mid-step, her hand dropping from Miles' shoulder a beat too early. A screen descended from the ceiling above the head table. The lights dimmed, guests turned. Some clapped without knowing why. The first image was harmless. Miles as a toddler in a plastic sandbox, then in a school uniform holding a soccer trophy. Vacation photos followed. Family cruises, ski resorts, birthdays marked by elaborate cakes and stiff formal wear. It was a curated past, the kind you preserve for shareholders. Then the sequence shifted. A new face appeared, blonde, familiar only in the way certain types are. Expensive hair, curated expressions, always framed in golden light. She was photo after photo beside Miles, at first in groups, then in pairs, arms wrapped around each other at cocktail events. Sitting close at a rooftop bar, one, more intimate, with her head on his shoulder while he looked away from the camera. I studied the timestamps. They weren't old. One showed a Christmas tree still standing in the background. Another had snow piled against a lodge window. February, maybe March. The woman was not Camille. By the time the screen displayed a shot of her holding a handwritten sign, the room had silenced itself. The message was casual, almost flippant. A note to Miles, a reference to the real thing, a suggestion, not a threat, as though this entire gathering were a placeholder. Then the screen went dark. A half-second beat followed. Nothing moved. Camille didn't speak? Not yet. Miles stood beside her, his hands loose at his sides. The guests remained still, waiting for someone to decide what came next. I adjusted the volume. I didn't realize my hand was shaking until I heard the glass on my table clink against the bottle beside it. Patricia stepped forward. Her voice was audible through a nearby mic left live, but she didn't speak loudly. Her tone was light, the way someone might describe an unfortunate scheduling mix-up. She named the woman Lillian, clarified her family background, referred to a business alignment, generational expectations, a future that makes sense. My mother's posture changed on screen. She sat straighter, her hand stopped dabbing her eyes. My father, seated beside her, crossed his arms. Not defensively, strategically. Camille hadn't moved. When she did, it was subtle, a shift in weight, a hand rising to adjust her veil, though it had already been pinned perfectly in place. Naomi appeared at her side again, speaking low, urgently. Camille listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. Behind them, the screen remained suspended, blank, like an eye waiting to reopen. I reached for my phone and saw 2 missed messages from Brandon. Both short, both unreadable in content, but sharp in implication. One had a file attached. The stream trembled. For a moment, the frame distorted, sound cut. When it returned, Camille was alone in the shot, standing just off-center in the hall. Guests had backed away. A circle was forming around her, not out of deference, but confusion. She held a white envelope now. It had appeared without announcement. There was no drama in the way she opened it, no flourish. Just a deliberate fold back of paper. Her eyes scanned its contents. No reaction registered. She folded it closed, handed it to Naomi, and took a step forward. Miles turned to her, reached slightly, but stopped. He seemed to sense something in her movement. Not danger exactly, but intention. A vector that didn't include him. Patricia was still speaking, her voice now layered with urgency. Behind her, the family attorney adjusted his cufflink. Lillian remained near the edge of the crowd, not participating, not retreating. A waiter passed through the scene, unaware, collecting empty glasses. The camera shifted again. It captured Camille from behind this time, her train spread across the floor like something rooted, heavy. The DJ didn't speak. The music had stopped. Nothing filled the air but the quiet friction of too many people trying not to breathe too loudly. I knew something was coming. It wasn't a feeling, it was the pattern, the stillness before fracture, the choreography of someone who's waited until the world was watching. Camille's hand dropped to her side, her fingers clenched, then released. The screen stuttered and froze. The stream resumed with the stuttering motion of a camera struggling to recover from shock. Camille was no longer centered in the frame. Someone had moved the tripod, or perhaps the operator had stepped back instinctively, uncertain of what might unfold next. The silence had broken, not with a scream or a crash, but with a low murmur that grew in volume and sharpness. It moved like static electricity through the crowd, setting off subtle spasms of reaction. Sharp inhales, sidelong glances, hands rising to cover mouths. Miles stood just off-center, his champagne glass still in hand, though he no longer drank. His gaze darted between Camille and the gathering crowd. The confident posture he had worn all evening had loosened. Now his shoulders sagged slightly, one foot turning inward as though preparing to retreat without moving. Patricia continued speaking. Her voice had taken on an edge now, half explanation, half defense. She gestured toward the darkened screen, toward Lillian, toward nothing in particular. The attorney at her side tried to interject. Camille said nothing. Naomi hovered close, her eyes scanning the room, but Camille had not asked for assistance. She simply stood, veil shifting slightly in the conditioned air, dress luminous beneath the scattered light. The space around her had widened, a ring of distance carved not by force but by something more precise, certainty. Then the ring broke. A voice, unclear in origin, shouted something about property, about heirlooms. The sound was sharp and nasal, quickly matched by another voice, deeper, more clipped. I couldn't see who spoke first, but the result was immediate. A man I recognized as Miles's brother surged forward, his eyes fixed on Camille's hand. The ring. There was movement, a failed grab, a misstep. Someone collided with a waiter carrying a tray of full glasses. Crystal shattered across the floor, a dozen echoes exploding outward. The crowd recoiled. In the chaos, the head table was jolted, several centerpieces toppled, water pooling among embroidered place cards. Patricia turned sharply, shouting now. My father moved instinctively, stepping toward Camille. His hand was raised, not in violence but in defense. The attorney raised his voice, calling for order. No one responded. It was not a moment that could be governed. Then the cake fell. The 8-tier monument, balanced for hours in its chilled corner, had been grazed in the commotion. It wobbled once, twice, then collapsed in a slow, inevitable arc. White fondant cracked, sugar flowers scattered, raspberry filling oozed like an exposed wound across the parquet floor. The room fell momentarily still. Then Lillian laughed. It was a clean, melodic sound, too well placed, too practiced. A sound that turned the eyes of 100 guests toward her and cemented without question, her role in the scene. She stepped forward, dress catching light like a flare. Her hand grazed Miles's arm. He didn't flinch, but his expression changed. He no longer looked like a groom. He looked like a man trying to choose between two burning doors. My mother rose from her seat. I couldn't hear her words, but the way she reached for Camille's hand was familiar. It was not maternal, it was instinctive, protective. Patricia stepped between them, one hand still holding a napkin embroidered with the Granger crest. Camille didn't retreat. She simply turned and walked, past Miles, past the wreckage of the cake, past the murmuring half-circle of guests who parted without knowing they'd done so. She didn't run. Her pace was deliberate. As she passed Naomi, the envelope changed hands again. I saw Naomi glance down at it once more, then nod, once almost imperceptibly. Camille reached the front of the room, where the microphone still stood unattended. She did not speak into it. She placed the envelope beside it and kept walking. Behind her, Miles called something. I couldn't make out the words. He took a step forward, but Lillian touched his arm again, and he stopped. The camera tilted, as if the operator had finally decided to follow her movement. Camille walked past the guests, past the long rows of tables, toward the exit at the far end of the hall. She paused once to collect her bouquet from a floral arrangement. It had been set aside earlier, perhaps for a final photo. She turned. Patricia reached out, to object, to reclaim something, perhaps out of habit more than intention. Camille didn't flinch. She raised the bouquet with a steadiness that felt ceremonial. Then she threw it. The arc was clean. It struck Miles at the collarbone, petals bursting against his tuxedo like confetti with an edge. He stumbled slightly, blinked, then said nothing. My father stepped between Camille and the gathering crowd. He didn't speak either. He simply moved with her toward the door, hand resting lightly at the small of her back, as if she was still a child who needed guidance crossing a busy street. The feed held on that final moment longer than necessary. Lillian stood by the ruined cake, her expression finally breaking. Patricia had turned away. Naomi stood by the microphone, one hand still gripping the envelope. Camille's veil caught on the doorframe as she exited. It didn't tear. It slipped free. Someone finally killed the stream. The image disappeared into static. I stared at the blank screen for a long time before realizing I had not moved in minutes. Outside, Seattle was still dark. A cargo ship passed slowly beyond the window, its lights trailing across the bay like a procession no one watched. My glass was empty, the bottle uncorked. My phone buzzed with unread messages, none from the people I wanted to hear from most. But I didn't check them. I closed the laptop, stood, removed the string lights from the window without ceremony, folded the dress I would not wear again, and turned off the last light in the room. The following morning, I received a call from my mother just after sunrise. Her voice was strained but composed. Camille was safe. She had spent the night at our parents' home, tucked away from the reporters who had already begun circling the venue before the last tablecloth had been removed. The Grangers had entered crisis mode. Lawyers had been dispatched. NDAs were being whispered into phones. Social media content flagged and scrubbed by the hour. The footage, what had survived the live stream, began to circulate in fragments. A clip of the bouquet colliding with Miles's tuxedo. A still of the cake collapse. A blurry video, clearly recorded on someone's phone, showing Camille walking toward the exit, train dragging behind her, bouquet in hand. The audio was distorted, but the silence spoke loudly. There was no chaos in her walk. That people noticed. I didn't watch any of it more than once. The files were saved, archived, but untouched. What mattered was what followed. Quietly, and then not so quietly, the narrative began to shift. Camille didn't speak publicly. She didn't need to. Other people did it for her. Naomi, days later, submitted her resignation to the firm where she and Miles both had advisory roles. The resignation letter circulated anonymously online, though the tone made authorship unmistakable. It didn't mention names, but it referenced a culture of silence, of coercion disguised as etiquette. Then came the email from Camille's former school, an offer to return, should she wish to. The board had voted unanimously. Several former colleagues added their names to the invitation, citing her absence as deeply felt and her presence, if restored, as something more than welcome. No demands, no conditions, just space left open in case she was ready. Camille declined, but not because she was unwilling. She had moved to Seattle by then. Temporarily at first, she stayed in my spare bedroom, which hadn't seen a guest in over 2 years. It still smelled faintly of unopened cardboard. She didn't unpack all at once, just a suitcase, then a small box of books, then a coffee mug she'd brought from Oregon, placed without ceremony beside mine on the kitchen shelf. We rarely discussed the wedding. Not directly, but the subject hovered, present in the gaps, in the long, companionable silences over morning coffee. In the way she sometimes opened her laptop, then closed it again, without typing a word. In the evenings, we sat on the balcony, wrapped in blankets, watching the city flicker. The sound of the water below, the hum of lives continuing elsewhere. Camille enrolled in a continuing education course that summer. Photography, something she'd once considered frivolous, the kind of indulgence our mother used to label impractical. But she went, every Thursday evening, like a ritual. She didn't talk about it afterward, but her photos began appearing, casually pinned to the refrigerator, laid out in slow piles on the coffee table. They were not wedding photos. They were not portraits. They were alleys, clouds, streetcars in motion, patterns of rust and light. The job offer came in August. A non-profit focused on education equity had seen the footage. Not the wedding itself, but a segment from the reception, the moment Camille handed over the envelope. Someone on their board had paused the video, seen something in her posture. They reached out quietly through mutual contacts, a consultancy role, No pressure, just interest. She considered it for a week, then she accepted. By fall, she had her own apartment across town, small, spare, filled with natural light. She kept the walls mostly bare, a few photographs printed large, unframed. Her coffee table held more books than I remembered her owning. No television, a stereo instead, playing vinyl late into the evenings. We still had dinner, most Sundays. Sometimes we cooked, sometimes we didn't. The ritual mattered more than the meal. Occasionally, someone recognized her, usually at the grocery store, a nod, a pause, sometimes a comment about bravery or composure. She never lingered, she never denied it, but she didn't invite the conversation either. Her story had been made public without her permission. She would not perform it for applause. My parents changed in small ways. My mother's calls became more frequent, less filtered. She asked questions now about Camille, about me, not of obligation, but curiosity, as though she had finally understood that silence was not the same as strength. My father, who had once measured success in units of compliance, began correcting family members who referred to the wedding as unfortunate. He didn't argue. He simply said, she did what was necessary. That was enough. By the end of the year, Camille was invited to speak at a panel on public resilience. She declined, but she wrote a short essay, anonymous, introspective, published in a small online journal. It made its way through quiet channels. People read it. They shared it. Not because it was loud, but because it didn't need to be. I read it once, then printed it, folded it neatly, and kept it between the pages of a book I never lent to anyone. I didn't need her permission, but I respected the distance. We never returned to Oregon. There was no reason to. The Grangers receded, their damage contained, but not forgotten. Miles never contacted Camille again, not directly. An envelope arrived once, unmarked, unsigned, postmarked out of state. Camille opened it, scanned the contents, and fed it through my shredder without a word. The machine hummed softly, then stopped. And that was that. The invitation arrived folded inside a plain white envelope. No logos, no gold embossing, just my name, printed with quiet intention on the front. I found it on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a real estate flyer I would never read. The sender was a university I hadn't thought about in years, my alma mater. There was an upcoming symposium, a weekend gathering centered around ethics, digital narratives, and public memory. A panel discussion on resilience in modern storytelling. They wanted me to join. There was no mention of the wedding, no reference to Camille, or to the footage that had long since faded from trending lists and front pages. The invitation referred only to my name, my work, and the perspective I might bring. It was the first time in over a year that I had been addressed without a shadow trailing behind. I accepted. The flight to Boston felt familiar in a way that surprised me. The smell of airport coffee, the hum of early boarders filing past with rolled-up sweaters and tired eyes. I didn't dress for impact. A charcoal blazer, flat shoes. I carried a slim folder with my notes, but I knew I wouldn't use them. There were things I understood now that couldn't be rehearsed. The hall was modest, wood-panelled walls, tiered seating, filtered afternoon light. I sat with two other speakers. One was a professor of journalism, the other, a documentary filmmaker. They spoke first about constructed truths and the ethics of presence. I listened, took small sips of water. My hands didn't shake. When it was my turn, I stood without ceremony. No slideshow, no script. I spoke about observation, about distance, about what it meant to see clearly, not from above, but from the edge of something falling apart. I didn't name my sister. I didn't mention the stream. But I let the weight of the moment settle between sentences. I let silence carry its own kind of truth. When it ended, the applause was gentle but sustained. People waited to speak with me afterward. They asked about process, perspective. One student, maybe 20, held out a small notebook for me to sign. I hesitated, then wrote a sentence I hadn't planned. Not everything that breaks is a failure. I left the auditorium alone, walked through the early spring chill, hands in pockets. Somewhere behind me, a woman was laughing into her phone. The sound carried across the campus quad, familiar and free. Weeks later, I received a letter from Camille. Not an email, not a text. Real ink on textured paper. She didn't say much, just that she had read the transcript, that she understood more than I thought, and that she had taken a new role in her organization, lead strategist for their public education branch. She was presenting at her first conference in June. She asked if I might attend. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into a book I kept beside the bed. That Sunday, I cooked dinner. The window was open, and the wind carried in the scent of rain on concrete. The apartment was quiet in a way that didn't feel empty. I set the table for two out of habit more than hope. Camille didn't come that night, but I left her a plate in the fridge. Some journeys don't circle back. They fold inward, then unfold in new directions. What remains is not the echo of what failed, but the shape of what was carried through it. Somewhere between rupture and resolution, you remember that dignity isn't given. It's reclaimed, quietly, completely, in your own name. Sometimes the moments that shape us the most aren't the ones where we speak loudly or fight back with fire. Sometimes they're the moments we choose stillness over spectacle, when we walk away not in defeat, but in clarity. Camille didn't win by exposing anyone. She didn't need to. The truth unfolded on its own, piece by piece, for those willing to see it. What she reclaimed wasn't revenge, but space. Space to think, to breathe, to remember who she was before the expectations, before the applause, before the performance. And maybe that's the quiet victory most of us overlook. Not proving others wrong, but proving ourselves right, in our own time, in our own way. We all carry moments like that. Moments when we know something is off but stay silent to keep the peace. Or when we step away and are called selfish, only to realise later it was the most honest thing we could have done. So I leave you with this. What if dignity isn't something the world gives us? What if it's something we reclaim when we stop trying to be what it needs and start becoming who we already are? I'm glad you were here for this story. And if it stirred something in you, even quietly, maybe that's where your own begins.